A prankster claiming to have proof of a Loch monster turns up dead, and suddenly Hamish Macbeth is left to separate myth from murder. In Loch, even a hoax can hide a dangerous truth. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? Your comments make this cozy corner feel even warmer. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next mystery. The cold had settled early that evening, one of those highland chills that came down from the moors without warning and wrapped itself round the village of Loch like a wet shawl. Hamish Macbeth felt it creeping under his coat as he walked the Loch path, hands buried deep in his pockets, the old familiar weight of his police radio bumping uselessly against his hip. The damp always made the thing crackle, but he kept it on out of habit. Lugs trotted beside him, ears twitching at every shift of wind along the water. Mist lay low on the loch, drifting in slow curls that blurred the opposite shore. Even the outline of the hills was softened to pale grey. A few gulls circled above, their cries oddly muffled. The whole scene had that uneasy stillness that came before rain or gossip, sometimes both. Hamish paused near the bend where the path opened to a small rocky stretch. Loch always felt like itself in these quiet moments. Steady, worn, a little lonely. He understood it well. Lug stopped too, nose working. A bit early for midges, Hamish murmured, though he doubted the dog was bothered about insects. Lugs gave a low rumble, not quite a growl, but enough to make Hamish squint ahead. There, barely visible through the damp haze, a figure hunched near the shoreline. A tripod, a large torch, wires coiled on the ground. Even at a distance, Hamish recognised the newcomer, the amateur filmmaker, with more opinions than sense, Gavin Corcoran. The man had blown into Loch a fortnight ago with the smug air of someone convinced he was destined for greatness, provided everyone else stopped being so inconvenient about it. Gavin bent over what looked like a battery pack, muttering to himself. Something sparked. He swore, slapped the casing, and carried on fiddling. Hamish let out a soft sigh. Fool'll electrocute himself. Lugs growled again, deeper this time. The dog's hackles stirred in a way Hamish trusted more than any equipment Strathbane ever issued. Whatever Gavin was up to tonight, it wasn't simply filming the scenery. Earlier that afternoon, Hamish had stopped by Patel's shop, mostly for tea and the faint hope of a biscuit. But the Crofters had been crowding the counter, grumbling about Gavin's so-called documentary. According to them, Gavin had been hinting, loudly, that the village was hiding a Loch monster for tourist money. He'd interviewed folk without asking, set lights on jetties without permission, and shoved a camera at anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. The Curry sisters had declared him a menace and an ignoramus, which, coming from them, was practically generous. Hamish had listened in silence, sipping Patel's overly sweet tea, saying nothing more than, "Aye, well, folk'll talk," but even then he had felt a small flicker of unease. Tempers could fray quickly in a place like Loch, where pride was stitched into every old stone and every quiet good morning. Now, watching Gavin crouched near the loch with his equipment, Hamish felt that flicker again. Lugs tugged the lead toward the water, muscles tense. "Leave it," Hamish murmured. "We've enough bother without you barking at fools." Still, he watched the filmmaker a while longer. Through the mist, Gavin's torch beam wavered like a pale fish, flickering on and off. The man stood abruptly, peering toward the village, as if expecting an audience. Then, just as suddenly, he swung the torch in a wide circle, testing angles. Hamish shook his head. "He'll be filming midges next. Call it evidence." He turned away. This was no evening for trouble. The wind was picking up, carrying the cold smell of rain and peat smoke. Somewhere up the hill, a dog barked, a short, sharp sound that echoed faintly. One of the hotel guests, probably. They'd been complaining to Mrs. Wellington that Loch felt eerily quiet after dark, which Hamish thought was its main charm. By the time he reached his cottage, his hands were chilled and his coat damp enough to cling. The place looked its usual self, a small frayed refuge with a peat fire that behaved like a sulky old woman. Hamish crouched to coax it into life, muttering under his breath as the flames hesitated, coughed, and finally decided to exist. Lugs curled near the hearth, snout tucked beneath one paw, though his eyes flicked now and then to the door, as if expecting someone to charge in, uninvited. Hamish hung up his coat, filled the kettle, and put the radio on the table. The kettle began its slow rumble. Outside, the mist thickened against the window pane until the world beyond became nothing but a grey smear. This sort of weather had a way of making Loch feel smaller, as though the village had drawn itself into a tight circle for warmth. Just as he was settling into his chair, with 2 digestives and the faint hope of a quiet evening, the phone rang. The line crackled with the familiar damp static that made every call sound like a ghost story. Hamish picked up. "Aye? Hamish, it's Mrs. Wellington." Her voice carried the clipped irritation of someone holding herself back from a proper rant. "It's that Corcoran fellow again." Hamish pinched the bridge of his nose. "What's he done now?" "He's been stomping about the hotel car park with lights so bright they'd wake the saints. Annoying my guests. One of them swears he saw Gavin pointing a torch straight at their window. I'm not running a circus, Hamish. No, indeed. And he said, and I quote, that he needed night energy for his documentary, whatever that means." Hamish grimaced. "Probably nothing sensible. Can't you talk to him before someone throws him in the loch?" He hesitated. "I'll have a word." Mrs. Wellington made a sound that could only be described as a harumph before hanging up. The line crackled into silence. Hamish looked at Lugs, who simply stared back as if to say, "You're not surprised, surely?" "No, I'm not," Hamish admitted. "Folk have been patient, but he's pushing it." He stood, poured tea into a cup that had seen better days, and tried to settle once more by the fire. But the cottage felt unusually restless tonight, as if the damp air itself carried a warning. Lugs shifted, ears flicking. Hamish felt the old familiar prickle along the back of his neck, the one that told him village trouble wasn't far off. Some cases announced themselves loudly. Others crept in on foggy nights, and the uneasy whisper of gossip. Outside, the mist pressed against the glass, swallowing the faint glow from the loch. Even the sounds of the village, usually a distant comfort, had faded. No footsteps on the road, no late-night chatter drifting from the hotel, only the low hiss of rain beginning to fall, a soft, cold drizzle that promised a long, uncomfortable spell of weather. Hamish put his cup down and glanced once more toward the window. He told himself it was only another nuisance brewing, nothing more. Folk exaggerated, especially when a newcomer stirred the pot. The Loch monster nonsense would blow over like every other village fad. Yet deep down, something felt off. Gavin Corcoran didn't strike Hamish as a man with sense enough to leave well alone. And Loch, for all its beauty, had a long memory for slights. Pride bruised easily here, and resentment was a hardy weed. Lugs gave a soft whine, turning toward the door. Hamish got up, walked over, and checked the latch. The damp had swollen the wood. The door stuck slightly before settling. He stared into the thick grey outside, seeing nothing but shifting fog. "Aye, I know," he murmured. "Something's up." He returned to his chair, but restful warmth refused to settle. The fire crackled half-heartedly. The kettle hissed. Lugs lay with his head on his paws, eyes open, watchful. In the distance, barely audible through the fog, a faint metallic clang echoed from the direction of the loch. Hamish sat up straighter. Gavin's equipment, most likely, or perhaps just a stray boat rope in the wind. Either way, he felt a small knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't danger exactly, not yet. Just the feeling of a stone dropped quietly into still water, sending ripples that hadn't reached him. Yet. Something unpleasant was brewing in Loch. He could sense it as clearly as Lugs did, and if the mist outside the window was anything to go by, the village was already holding its breath. Morning came grudgingly to Loch, as if the daylight itself had decided there was little point in hurrying. A flat, pewter-grey sky hung low over the village, and the drizzle that had threatened the night before settled in with quiet determination. Hamish Macbeth pulled his collar up against the damp as he stepped out of his cottage, Lugs bounding ahead with the cheerful purpose of a dog who believed every morning walk held the possibility of adventure. Hamish, however, felt no such optimism. The cold air clung to him, seeping through his thin jacket. He made a mental note, again, to mend the tear in the lining. He wouldn't, of course. He never got round to these things. The road was slick beneath his boots, and the loch, half shrouded in mist, looked like a great drowsy creature, waking reluctantly to the day. Lugs trotted a few paces ahead, and then paused, nose lifted to the wind. The dog's tail stiffened. Hamish frowned. "What is it now?" he muttered, though he trusted the dog's instincts more than he ever admitted aloud. They walked the narrow path running along the reeds. The damp made the wooden posts creak softly, a sound that carried eerily over the quiet water. Lugs moved forward with growing urgency, ears flat, body tense. Hamish followed, his breath clouding faintly in the chill. They reached the thickest part of the reeds, when Lugs let out a sharp whine. Not fear, warning. Hamish stepped closer, pushing aside the wet stalks. Something pale caught his eye. His stomach tightened in a way that was all too familiar to him. He bent down. Gavin Corcoran lay half submerged in the shallows, his limbs at odd angles, wet hair plastered to his forehead. The man's equipment lay scattered nearby, a torch partly buried in mud, wires tangled like weeds. The water lapped against his jacket with an indifferent rhythm. Hamish crouched, the drizzle pattering on his shoulders. He felt the old quiet heaviness settle in him, the one that came whenever death visited the village. He didn't sigh. He simply stayed still for a moment, letting the truth of it settle. Lugs whined again, circling closer, but not touching the body. "Aye," Hamish said softly. "I see." He stood and brushed a wet strand of hair from his forehead, though it did nothing to help the damp already chilling him. His own landline had been behaving poorly since last night's weather tantrum. He would have to use the hotel's phone. Mrs. Wellington answered on the second ring, her tone clipped and already hinting at alarm. "Mrs. Wellington, I'm at the Loch. I need to use your line to call Strathbane, Hamish said. It's important." She didn't ask for details. People in Loch rarely did when Hamish used that tone. Moments later, he was calling HQ on the hotel phone, the cord smacking lightly against the wall as he shifted. Blair arrived with Anderson in short order, their car splashing mud up the roadside. Blair stepped out as though personally offended by the weather, the village, and Hamish all at once. His small eyes darted around, assessing the scene with a theatrical importance that Hamish found tiresome. "What have you blundered into this time, Macbeth?" Blair demanded, stomping toward the reeds. Anderson trailed behind him, clipboard in hand, rain dripping from his nose. Hamish kept his expression mild. "Found a body, sir." "Of course you did," Blair snarled. "And you've probably trampled all over the scene, ruined any useful evidence, if there was any to begin with." Hamish offered a faint shrug. "Couldn't very well leave him in the water." Blair made a noise that suggested he doubted Hamish's ability to leave anything untouched. He pushed through the reeds and nearly lost his footing. The ground was slick and uneven, and Gavin's equipment cables snaked through the mud in a way that invited disaster. "Watch your—" Hamish began, too late. Blair tripped on a half-buried cord, flailing wildly before catching himself on a tussock of reeds. His boots sank several inches into the mud. Anderson pretended not to notice, though the slight lift of his brows betrayed amusement. Hamish allowed himself one dry internal remark before kneeling near Gavin's body again. Blair's stumbling had given him a moment's cover. He leaned in, eyes narrowing at a curious detail on the filmmaker's wrist, an odd, circular burn mark, small but obvious to anyone with patience enough to look. Hamish's gaze drifted further. Footprints trailed away from the water, leading back toward the village. Not just Gavin's. Someone else had been here. While Blair shouted at Anderson for a measuring tape he didn't actually know how to use, Hamish stood and stepped back. He'd seen enough for now. Soon the villagers began to gather, drawn the way folk always were by the scent of trouble. The drizzle had thickened, becoming a steady curtain that blurred faces and edges. People huddled beneath umbrellas or old coats, murmuring among themselves. The Curry sisters appeared first, breathless with excitement. "Terrible business," Harriet said, her eyes glittering. "But you mark my words, there's something unnatural about it." "Unnatural?" her sister asked. "I'd say plain stupidity. He was always poking where he shouldn't." Hamish gave them a nod but kept walking. He didn't trust them not to start a rumour that Gavin had been swallowed whole by a creature with tentacles. Patel stood near the hotel wall, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, brows drawn together in troubled thought. "Morning, Hamish," he said quietly. "People'll talk nonsense all day now. Monster this, monster that." Hamish nodded. "Folk get fanciful when the weather's gloomy." Patel gave a weary sigh. "Aye, and when there's a stranger stirring the pot." Hamish looked past him, toward the small clusters forming. Crofters leaning close, fishers shaking their heads, tourists staring wide-eyed, delighted by the potential of danger. The mixture of fear, curiosity, and judgment felt thick in the air. Gavin's presence in Loch had been brief, but evidently long enough for him to make enemies, or at least irritate the wrong people. Blair continued barking at Anderson until he decided shouting at Hamish would be more satisfying. "You!" Blair snapped, stomping toward him. "Where were you last night? And don't you lie to me, Macbeth." Hamish met the man's glare calmly. "At home." "Convenient?" "Not particularly," Hamish replied dryly. "My fire wouldn't stay lit." Blair opened his mouth, likely ready with a threat or insult, but one of the tourists slipped on the path with a yelp, distracting him. Blair swung round, roaring at the poor man to clear off. Hamish used the opportunity to kneel beside Lugs, who was sniffing the damp ground in measured sweeps. "What do you think, boy?" Hamish murmured. Lugs looked up, ears twitching, tail low. Not fear, but alertness. The dog's gaze went again to the line of footprints at the edge of the reeds. Hamish followed the direction, feeling the drizzle seep into his hair and collar. Whoever had been here last night had left in a hurry. The prints were uneven, deeper at the heel. Someone running, someone panicked. He straightened slowly. The murmuring around him had grown louder. "Do you think it was the monster?" a tourist whispered. "Aye, well," one of the crofters muttered. "If the fool went wandering at night, he'd frighten himself to death." Another voice chimed in, sharper, more suspicious. "Maybe someone had enough of his accusing tongue." Hamish glanced at the villagers. Some looked uneasy, others guilty, some watchful. The gossip was spreading already, winding through the village like smoke through old rafters. The drizzle thickened into proper rain. Drops pattered on Hamish's shoulders, ran down the back of his neck. The grey sky pressed lower still, the loch now little more than a shifting sheet of steel. Blair stomped back, face red. "Macbeth, you're to stay out of this. I'll not have you muddling matters." Hamish gave him a mild look. "Wouldn't dream of it." Blair snorted and turned away, missing the slight lift at the corner of Hamish's mouth. A good performance, if he did say so himself. The body was being moved now. Anderson slipped twice, earning more shouting. The villagers drifted toward their homes or shops, still muttering, still glancing at one another with suspicion. Loch had always been a place where grudges lasted longer than storms. Pride, too. Hamish stood there, a moment longer, rain seeping into his cuffs. Lugs pressed close, watching the last of the villagers disappear into the mist. Something about the scene smelled wrong. Not the body, but the silence around it. The way people looked at one another. The way some avoided his gaze. The loch rippled faintly, the reeds shivering in the wind. Hamish rubbed Lugs's head. "Aye, lad, best keep our wits about us." The rain poured harder, washing the footprints into oblivion. The morning after Gavin Corcoran's body was taken away arrived with a sharp, needling cold that seemed determined to work its way through every layer of clothing Hamish owned. Loch lay beneath a thin, colourless light, as though the sun had decided it wasn't worth wasting effort on a village already dampened by drizzle and dread. Hamish stepped out of the station with Lugs at his heel, their breath misting in small bursts. A faint crust of frost clung to the grass, and the loch looked dull and hard, like a sheet of pewter hammered flat by a weary craftsman. The stillness of the water made the reeds stand out starkly, as though the memory of the body found there was etched into the morning itself. Blair had already returned to Strathbane, leaving behind Anderson with a stack of paperwork and a sour expression. The man avoided eye contact with Hamish, shuffling papers on the desk with exaggerated purpose. "You're to fill in the incident forms," Anderson said without looking up. Hamish rubbed the back of his neck. "Aye, well, Paperwork's never been my strong suit. Daviot wants them done today. Then he'll be disappointed, Hamish said mildly. I'm off to talk to folk. Anderson looked up sharply. Blair said. Hamish offered a blank, innocent expression. Sorry, what was that? Anderson floundered, muttering something about procedures. Hamish collected his coat and slipped out before the man found his footing. Lugs trotted behind, tail high, relieved to escape the fluorescent chill of the station. The village felt different this morning. Loch always responded to tragedy with a strange mixture of gossip and restraint. Folk talked more, but they did it in lowered voices, as though volume alone might worsen matters. Windows showed shadowy figures moving behind curtains. Doors opened just a crack wider than usual before closing again. Hamish headed first toward the Loch Hotel. Mrs. Wellington was sweeping the front steps, her scarf wrapped so tightly around her neck that only the tip of her nose was visible. She swept with brisk, almost punitive strokes, as though the brush itself had offended her. Morning, Hamish said. She stopped sweeping and fixed him with a glare sharp enough to chip ice. There's nothing good about mornings like this, Constable. Lugs sniffed the air near the steps, ears tilting back slightly. Hamish took the hint. Mrs. Wellington was simmering. I need to ask a few things about Gavin, he said gently. Her lips thinned, and she resumed sweeping with force. That man brought nothing but trouble, stirred up my guests, kept them awake with those ridiculous lights of his. Said he needed night energy, she snorted. Night annoyance, more like. You had words with him? We had a conversation, she corrected, though her tone suggested something far less civilized. I told him plainly his behaviour could cost me business. He said I lacked vision. Vision? As if blinding half the hotel was a mark of genius. Hamish nodded quietly, watching the way she gripped the broom. Did you see him last night? She hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the Loch. He stomped past the car park just after 10, torch in one hand, tripod in the other, nearly tripped over a guest's suitcase. I told him to mind himself, but he didn't even hear me. Hamish thanked her, leaving her to her sweeping, which had grown more vigorous still. As he walked away, Lugs cast one last look at her, as if checking she wouldn't accidentally beat the broom to splinters. A cold wind rattled the sign outside Patel's shop. Hamish pushed the door open, the bell above it giving a thin jangle. The smell of spices and old cardboard welcomed him, Patel's familiar domain. The man stood behind the counter, sorting tins of pilchards with meticulous precision. Hamish, Patel said without looking up. Terrible business. I warned him, you know, told him not to upset people, but Gavin thought he could march into Loch and make himself important. Patel finally lifted his gaze, his eyes worried. Folk don't take kindly to that. Hamish leaned against the counter. Who took it the worst? Patel sighed. Well, Mrs. Wellington, of course. Then there's Ewan McCrae. Gavin nearly tore his nets during one of his night escapades, and Andrew Black was angry about his boat lights being borrowed without permission. And Fiona, poor lass. Gavin accused her of pretending she'd seen something in the water, humiliated her, outside the post office no less. Hamish frowned. Did Fiona tell you that? No, her mother did. You know how things travel. Hamish did. In Loch gossip travelled faster than any motorcar, faster, sometimes, than truth. He thanked Patel and stepped back outside. The cold struck harder now, a brittle wind that picked up stray bits of rubbish and sent them tumbling along the road. Lugs shook himself vigorously, ears flicking with annoyance. Next stop was the harbour, where Ewan McCrae stood mending lines by his boat. The fisherman was a broad, weather-battered man, with a permanently furrowed brow that made him look angrier than he actually was. He knotted the rope with sharp, practiced movements. Morning, Ewan. Ewan didn't look up. Mind if I ask about Gavin? Aye, I mind, Ewan growled, then sighed. Oh, well, if you insist. I do. Ewan gave a reluctant shrug. He was a nuisance. Ruined a set of nets last week. Said it was an accident but didn't offer to pay. Nearly caught me in one of his shots with that blasted torch. Thought he was making a film for Hollywood. Hamish smiled faintly. Did you see him last night? No. I was down at the far end of the harbour checking traps. Ask my wife, she'll tell you. He paused. Look, Hamish, I didn't kill the daft man. I was angry, but not murderous. I know, Hamish said quietly, because he did. Ewan was too blunt to hide guilt, and too proud to bother lying. He left the harbour and walked toward the crofts at the edge of the village. The path grew narrower and muddier, and mist crept in from the moors, softening the outline of the hills. Lugs sniffed the ground with renewed interest. Fiona McLeish opened the door before Hamish even knocked, as if she'd been watching for him. She was young, pale-faced, with earnest eyes that darted away whenever someone looked too closely. "Constable Macbeth," she said, smoothing her apron. "Mum's out at the Kirk Hall, but you'll be wanting to ask about yesterday. If you don't mind." She stepped aside. The Croft kitchen was warm and smelled faintly of oatcakes. A kettle hissed on the stove. Fiona poured him tea with shaky hands. "He embarrassed me," she whispered. "Outside the post office. Said I was lying for attention. Everyone heard." Her eyes filled with mortification rather than grief. "I didn't even like him. He was rude, always demanding things." Hamish stirred his tea. "Did you see him after that?" "No," she hesitated. "But my brother Hugh, he said Gavin came round to the Croft asking questions about the monster again. Hugh told him to get lost. Hugh got angry." She blinked, startled by the directness. "Hugh gets angry at midges if they land on him wrong." Hamish left her with thanks and followed the path back toward the village. The cold wind made his eyes water, or perhaps the sharpness of village tension did. Lugs walked close, senses alert. His next stop was the small boat shed where Andrew Black kept his rental equipment. Andrew leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, scowl firmly in place. "If this is about Gavin's lights," Andrew said before Hamish spoke, "I already told Blair I didn't kill the idiot." "I'm asking everyone, Sarah," Hamish said gently. "Folk need to know I'm looking into things properly." Andrew's scowl softened a fraction. "He owed me money, and he broke 2 of my torches trying to rig up some daft contraption. He said they'd help him capture the beast. I told him the only beast was himself." "Did you see him last night?" Andrew shifted. "No, I was at home, my wife can say so." Hamish nodded, watching the man's jaw tighten. Andrew wasn't violent, but he did brood. Brooding could lead to mistakes. Finally, Hamish made his way to the kirk. Reverend McPhee stood outside, brushing frost from the stone steps, with a dignity that suggested he believed the weather itself should have known better than to lay frost on holy ground. "Constable," he said with a solemn nod, "a sad day. You had words with Gavin." "We all had words with Gavin," the Reverend responded sharply. Then he sighed. "Yes, I reprimanded him. He was exploiting local folklore for personal gain. I told him we do not cheapen our heritage for spectacle." His expression tightened. He laughed at me. Hamish let the minister talk. People often said more when they believed they were saying very little. By the time Hamish and Lugs reached the Loch path again, the cold had deepened. The water looked darker, almost bruised. A few ducks cut ripples across the surface, their movements the only sign of life in the stillness. Hamish walked slowly, thinking. The guilt in Loch wasn't loud. It never was. It huddled beneath pride, shame, pettiness, and old grievances. Gavin hadn't died because of some grand conspiracy. Hamish felt that deep in his bones. "We hurt each other over small things," he murmured to Lugs. "Small things that build." Lugs nudged his hand, as if agreeing. Hamish stopped at the reeds where Gavin's body had lain. The surface of the loch reflected the bleak sky in dull patches. The wind cut through his coat. The footprints from yesterday were washed away, erased by rain and the rising tide. But the emotional impressions, that was another matter. They lingered in the village air, in the wary glances, in the unspoken grievances. Hamish stood there, a long moment, feeling the weight of Loch quiet woes pressing like cold mist against his skin. Something ordinary had gone wrong. Something painfully human. He turned toward the village, Lugs padding faithfully beside him. The cold sharpened further still, hinting at snow in the coming days. There was a truth here. He could sense it. Small, buried, but waiting. And Hamish Macbeth, whether Strathbane liked it or not, would find it. The light inside the Loch police station flickered twice before settling into its usual dull glow, the sort that made even clean rooms feel tired. Hamish Macbeth set Gavin Corcoran's effects on the table. Camera lens, torch casing, a muddied length of wire, and leaned over them with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too many foolish inventions end in disaster. The cold clung to him even indoors. Luggs paced once, circled, and sat with a huff beside the desk, his gaze fixed on the table, as though the clues might move if he watched long enough. Hamish picked up the broken lens. Its edge was smeared with a blackened residue, gritty under his thumb. He sniffed it lightly. Burnt plastic, batteries overheating. He didn't need Strathbane's forensics. He rarely needed them. Years of village mishaps had taught him what faulty equipment looked like. He set the lens down and turned the dead man's wrist toward the light. The burn mark wasn't large, but it was distinct, a crisp circle, as though something round and hot had touched him briefly. A battery pack spark, most likely. Gavin had been tinkering with his torch rig so much that half the village had started avoiding him after dark. Faulty wiring, Hamish murmured. Or someone made sure it was faulty. Luggs gave a soft grunt, nose nudging the table leg. I know, Hamish said quietly. It's no accident he ended up in the water last. Footsteps scuffed behind him, the awkward, hesitant gait that only Anderson could manage. Macbeth, Anderson said, clearing his throat. Blair says you're not to interfere with the technical evidence. It's being sent to Strathbane. Hamish turned slowly, schooling his expression into mild confusion. Is it now? Oh, well, best leave it be then. I'll just make myself a cup of tea. Anderson frowned at him suspiciously, sensing disobedience, but unable to prove it. Hamish moved toward the kettle, Luggs padding faithfully beside him. When Anderson left to answer the telephone, Hamish slipped the lens back into the evidence bag with deliberate care and shrugged into his coat. Come on, boy, he whispered. We've enough to be going on with. Outside, the air had grown colder still, carrying that particular bite that warned snow wasn't far off. The clouds had darkened into a heavy grey mass, dragging low above the loch. Hamish walked the path toward Andrew Black's boathouse, boots crunching over patches of stiffening mud. The boathouse stood at the edge of the loch, its wooden planks damp and darkened, smelling faintly of old rope, motor oil, and the tang of wet timber. Andrew was outside, hunched over a coil of line, cigarette tucked behind one ear, arms bare despite the cold. When he saw Hamish approaching, he straightened and wiped his hands on his trousers, his expression shuttering itself in a heartbeat. Hamish, he said cautiously, you're here about the body. Hamish nodded, keeping his voice gentle. Just tying up loose ends, Andrew. Villagers like their questions answered. Andrew snorted. Villagers like gossip. That too, Hamish said softly. He stepped inside the boathouse, Luggs close behind. The dim interior was cluttered with oars, nets, spare bulbs, fuel cans, and Andrew's collection of tools. Hamish ran his hand over a rusted lantern, studying the shelves without appearing to study them. You ever help Gavin with his filming setup? Hamish asked. Andrew stiffened. I lent him lights once. Shouldn't have. He returned them half broken. Accident. If you call stupidity an accident, Andrew replied, too quickly. Hamish turned to him, eyes mild. Just trying to get a picture of things. Man with that much equipment. Well, he needed help sometimes, I imagine. Andrew shifted, folding his arms. His boots squeaked faintly on the damp floor. Luggs watched him with unsettling intensity. I don't fix things for free, Andrew said, and he didn't want to pay. Said I should be honoured to help him chase a legend. Hamish stepped closer. Did he ask you to look at his battery pack? A pause, a slight tightening around Andrew's jaw. He might have mentioned it, Andrew admitted. Said it sparked. I told him to leave it alone before he fried himself. That's the truth. Hamish nodded, patting Luggs on the head. And last night, where were you? With my wife, Andrew answered, but his gaze flicked to the window before settling back on Hamish. Ask her. I will, Hamish said gently. Andrew exhaled sharply, frustration breaking through. I didn't kill him, Hamish. I was angry, half the village was, but I wouldn't push a man into the water. I just wanted him gone. Hamish believed him, but belief wasn't proof. He thanked Andrew quietly and stepped out of the boathouse. The moors stretched beyond, still and pale beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a sheep bleated, a lonely sound swallowed quickly by the rising wind. As Hamish and Lugs walked back along the path, the mist began to drag over the loch like thin fingers. Lugs pressed against Hamish's leg, uneasy. "Aye, lad," Hamish murmured. "Folk are more dangerous than monsters." He felt the truth of it settle heavily. People didn't kill over great visions. They killed over insults, debts, the sting of humiliation, the little things that festered. The mist thickened, blurring the cottages along the loch's edge. Smoke curled from chimneys in thin streams, carrying the faint scent of peat that always reminded Hamish of long winter nights and a loneliness he rarely acknowledged aloud. He stopped outside Patel's shop. The bell jingled as he entered, and the warmth inside hit him like a soft slap. Patel looked up from a shelf of digestive biscuits. "Hamish, you're out in this weather? Brave man." "More foolish than brave, too," Hamish said. "Folk talking about Gavin again?" Patel grimaced. "When are they not? Today they say he bought a costume, some waterproof thing with fins and fabric, meant to fake a monster silhouette. Put it on my account, the cheek of him. Told me he would pay after he made his big break," Hamish sighed. "So the hoax wasn't a simple prank." "It never is with outsiders," Patel muttered. "They think Loch is a stage for their nonsense." Hamish stood under the yellow light, letting the murmurs of villagers drift around him. A pair of crofters argued near the counter about whether Gavin had planned to trick tourists into paying for tours. A fisher insisted he'd seen Gavin sneaking around the jetties 2 nights ago, looking shifty. The Curry sisters claimed he'd been consorting with spirits. Villagers always embroidered. But truth often nestled quietly beneath the stitching. Hamish bought a packet of tea he didn't need and stepped back outside. The cold struck him immediately, sharper than before. The loch now looked iron dark, the surface rippling with tight, wind-driven lines. "Come on, Lugs," he said softly. They walked the narrow road back toward the station, mist brushing against their faces like damp wool. Hamish's mind worked silently, weaving together small observations. Andrew's twitch, the burn mark, the costume, the debt. Pieces of a puzzle nobody wanted him to solve too quickly. Strathbane was hungry for quick results, Blair barking at everyone except the truth. But Loch was patient. It surrendered its secrets slowly. At the corner, Hamish paused, watching the way smoke rose from cottage chimneys. Loch looked peaceful, but he knew better. Beneath the calm lay bruised pride, resentment, humiliation, all the subtle sparks that started fires far more dangerous than Gavin's faulty battery. He walked on, the mist swallowing him and Lugs until they were little more than shadows moving through grey. Something had pushed Gavin to escalate his hoax, and someone, just as stubborn, had pushed back. Hamish felt it, quiet and sure as a shift in the wind. He would find out who. The morning broke with a sour metallic light that promised nothing good. A thick bank of clouds hunched low over Loch, and the wind coming off the loch carried the sharp, restless bite that often arrived before a proper Highland storm. Hamish Macbeth stood outside the station, hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching Lugs nose suspiciously at a clump of grass that didn't seem to warrant suspicion. The dog was tense, unsettled, picking up more than just weather. Hamish felt it too, that particular unease Loch slipped into when gossip tightened into fear. Before he could begin the day's quiet questioning, a familiar engine roar split the air. A Strathbane police car screeched into the village square with theatrical flourish, mud spraying in graceful arcs. Out hopped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, coat flapping like an offended crow, followed by Anderson, trying not to look as miserable as he felt. Blair's face was a deep shade of triumph. That alone was enough to make Hamish wary. "There he is," Blair shouted, pointing dramatically. "Macbeth, I've got the killer." Hamish's heart dipped. "Who, sir?" Blair smirked and gestured toward the back seat. Ewan McRae, the fisherman, was squeezed inside, arms folded, expression thunderous. Hamish blinked. "Ewan?" "Aye," Blair crowed. "Caught him skulking about the harbour. Shifty, that one." Hamish inhaled, slowly. "He's a fisherman, sir. Harbour's his workplace." Blair waved this off. "Motive, opportunity, temper, case closed." He puffed out his chest. "Daviot will be delighted. Loch can thank me later." Hamish stepped closer, ignoring the tightening of Blair's jaw. Ewan was at sea during the likely time of death. His wife said so. Blair rolled his eyes. "Och, Macbeth, you'll believe anything if it comes wrapped in village charm. I'm reporting you for obstruction." Hamish tilted his head, allowing a small, confused frown to settle on his face. "Obstruction, sir, I was only—" "Enough!" Blair barked, delighted with himself. "Anderson, bring the suspect out." Anderson obeyed, though his expression suggested he'd rather haul himself across broken glass. Ewan stepped out, shoulders stiff. "This is ridiculous," Ewan growled. "If I was murdering folk, Blair, you'd have been first." "Oh, threatening an officer, are you?" Blair shouted triumphantly. "Add that to the report." Hamish laid a calming hand on Ewan's arm. "Quiet now. Let me speak to Morag." Blair's nostrils flared. "Macbeth, don't you dare meddle." But Hamish had already turned away, wearing the mild, vague expression that confused Blair enough to buy precious seconds of freedom. He heard Blair sputtering behind him, Anderson attempting to soothe him, and Ewan muttering curses that would scandalise the Kirk. Hamish walked briskly through the village lanes with lugs bobbing beside him, tail stiff. The sky darkened further, heavy clouds crowding overhead like a ceiling about to collapse. He reached the McRae cottage. Before he knocked, Morag McRae pulled open the door, broad-shouldered, hair in a sturdy plait, eyes sharp enough to cut rope. "I know why you're here," she said without preamble. "Ewan didn't do it." "I don't believe he did either," Hamish replied softly. Morag nodded once, approval flickering across her face. "He was at sea that night. Ask old Donald at the next croft. He saw his boat's lantern out on the water when he took the dog out." "That's good to know," Hamish murmured, pulling out his notebook, though he rarely needed one. "Anything else?" Morag hesitated, shifting her weight. "Aye, there was something. 2 nights before Gavin died, the man was shouting at someone by the loch. Loud enough that I heard it from inside, but the silhouette wasn't Ewan. Too tall, and too rigid, shoulders like a barn beam. "Hugh McLeish?" Hamish suggested gently. Morag shrugged. "Could be, or someone else with a bad temper and something to hide." Hamish thanked her and stepped back into the darkening daylight. The wind lifted his hair, and the first spit of rain hit his cheek. Storm coming fast. He found Blair back in the square, berating Anderson for not polishing the car. Ewan had been shoved onto a bench like a misbehaving schoolboy. Hamish approached with lugs at his side. "Sir, Ewan has a firm alibi." Blair glared. "Shut it, Macbeth. Donald saw his lantern offshore. Morag heard Gavin fighting with someone else." Blair's face worked through anger, denial, and something close to panic. "I will not be made a fool of." Hamish managed not to answer the obvious. Blair released Ewan only because Anderson whispered something about Daviot wanting proper evidence for once. Ewan stomped home, muttering that the monster should eat Blair next. Not long after, the storm broke. Rain slammed down, sudden and violent, turning the village streets into dark, shining rivers. The wind shrieked along the Loch path, rattling window shutters and bending the reeds low. The phone lines flickered wildly. Lights in cottages blinked like sleepy eyes. Hamish retreated to his cottage. The peat fire was sulking again, reluctant to burn. He fed it a little kindling until it agreed to behave. Lugs sulked near the hearth. Ears flattened every time thunder rolled across the loch. Hamish brewed tea, weak, because the tin had more dust than leaves, and sat for a moment, listening to the storm batter the roof. Loch Dew storms always felt personal, as though the weather itself had chosen to scold the village. The power dipped once, twice, then steadied with a low hum. Hamish stood. He couldn't sit like this when the case gnawed at him. Rain or not, there was work to be done. "Come on, Lugs," he said quietly. Lugs looked disappointed, but followed. They stepped out into the storm. Rain soaked Hamish instantly, running cold down his collar. Lugs pushed close to his leg, bracing against the wind. They walked the moor path, the ground slick beneath their boots and paws. The reeds whipped in the wind, their hiss blending with the storm's howl. Hamish scanned the muddy path, eyes narrowed against the driving rain. There, faint impressions. Footprints softened by storm water, but still visible to someone with a trained eye and patient temperament. They led away from the village, toward the shadowed outline of an old croft long abandoned. Hamish followed slowly, careful of the treacherous ground. The croft loomed ahead, its roof sagging, its walls worn by decades of Highland weather. Rain drummed against the broken slates with a frantic rhythm. He reached the doorway. The wind rushed through the empty windows, making a low moaning sound. Lugs hesitated, ears pricking sharply. Inside, the air felt colder still. Dust, damp stone, and the faint tang of rust, and in the far corner, something metallic glinted in the beam of his torch. Hamish stepped closer, heart steady, mind sharp, despite the storm howling outside. The object caught the light again. Small, deliberate, wrong for an abandoned croft. Something connected here, a thread tugging tight. Rain lashed the walls as if urging him to turn back. But Hamish Macbeth stood still, letting the storm rage around him, and listened to the quiet truth the empty croft held, a truth someone had tried very hard to hide. The morning arrived thin and colourless, as though the light itself had been scraped clean by the storm. A pale wash of sun clung to the moors, not warming them, but outlining every dip and rise in a muted gold. The loch lay unusually still, its surface a cold mirror reflecting the lingering grey. Hamish Macbeth walked along the narrow track toward the abandoned croft, with lugs trotting close at heel. The air smelled faintly of wet peat and heather, bruised by the night's wind. Hamish pulled his jacket tighter. The storm had passed, but the cold that followed was sharp and decisive, making every breath feel like it carried a warning. Lugs paused near a patch of flattened grass, sniffing with focused intensity. Hamish crouched beside him. The prints were faint, washed soft by the torrential rain, but still recognisable as the same trail he'd followed last night. Someone had come and gone more than once, and not too long ago. Hamish straightened, gaze drifting over the moor. A flock of sheep huddled close to one another, their bleats muted by distance. A lone crow perched on a ruined fence post, feathers ruffled against the chill. The morning carried a thin melancholy, one he felt inside his ribs. When he reached the croft, it looked even more forlorn in daylight. Its roof sagged like an old man's shoulders. Stones had fallen from the outer wall, now lying half buried in moor grass. The door hung crooked, creaking softly whenever the breeze nudged it. Lugs whined low, ears twitching. Hamish gave him a reassuring pat before easing the door open. A damp, earthy smell drifted out. Moss, rot, and something faintly chemical from long-abandoned tools. Inside, the air was still, as though the croft had been holding its breath for years. Light fell in uneven slants through broken window panes. Dust hung in the beams. Hamish's eyes adjusted, revealing the disorder of recent activity scattered among decades of neglect. Waterproof fabric lay crumpled against a wall, its green sheen dulled by grime. A tangle of old fishing wires curled across the floor like coils of rusted serpents. A crude wooden frame leaned near the hearth, the kind of structure someone might build in haste, with more enthusiasm than skill. When he lifted it, the joints wobbled. It would have made a convincing silhouette on a misty night, with a torch behind it. So Gavin hadn't worked alone. Someone had helped him stage a Loch monster, but whether that someone regretted helping, or had become enraged by Gavin's escalating demands, was another matter entirely. Hamish crouched, running his fingers lightly over the floorboards. Mud smears, two sets of footprints, overlapping. One heavier, one lighter, someone tall, someone shorter. He exhaled quietly. Helping a hoaxer wasn't a crime. Sabotaging dangerous equipment, however, might be, and pushing a man into icy water certainly was. Lugs padded into a corner and sniffed at a pile of discarded cloth. When Hamish tugged it free, he found what looked like the shredded remains of an old wetsuit, slashed or torn. The edges bore signs of frustration rather than wear. Whoever had been working with Gavin had grown angry enough to destroy what they'd once helped build. Hamish stood slowly, brushing dust from his hands. A draught gusted through the broken windows, carrying with it the cries of distant birds. This croft had become a crossroads, where irritations brewed, where resentment simmered, where someone's temper had snapped. The whole affair felt less like a mystery, and more like a slow, sad unravelling of village patience. He stepped back outside, blinking at the sudden brightness of the moor. The mist had begun to slide in again, curling like pale smoke over the heather. Lugs barked sharply at something in the distance, but nothing moved except the shifting haze. Hamish laid a calming hand on the dog's head. "Easy, boy. Ghosts of the weather, that's all." Still, he didn't entirely believe his own words. The mist always felt alive in Loch, carrying whispers and warnings. Today it seemed to drift toward the village, as though eager to share whatever secrets the croft had sheltered. Hamish made his way back toward the Macleish croft, feeling the case branching in uncomfortable directions. Gavin had been reckless, arrogant, insensitive, but Hamish had seen enough death to know it rarely came from one big cause. It came from small pains gathered tight, from embarrassment, from debts unpaid, from words said in anger. Loch wasn't a place where people murdered for gain, but it was a place where pride ran deep and shame ran deeper. When he reached the Macleish home, Fiona was outside hanging laundry, though the cold was hardly fit for drying anything. Her movements were small and hurried, hands trembling slightly as she pinned a sheet with unnecessary force. Lugs trotted ahead, tail wagging gently. Fiona managed a faint smile. "Constable Macbeth," she said, brushing hair from her face. "You're out early." "Aye, wanted to follow up on something." Hamish kept his voice soft. "May I trouble you for a moment?" She nodded and led him inside. The kitchen was warm with the faint smell of porridge lingering. A kettle steamed on the stove. Fiona wrapped her hands around a mug as though bracing herself. "I've been to the old croft," Hamish said gently. "Found signs someone helped Gavin with his monster setup. Were you one of them?" Her shoulders tensed. She closed her eyes briefly before nodding. "Just once or twice. For a lark at first. He made it sound harmless." She swallowed hard. "I helped him design that silly silhouette. It was nothing grand, just something for a fright. And then? And then he started demanding more. Wanted better shapes, more wires, more fabric. He'd show up at the door at all hours. He said he needed authenticity, said the village was too small-minded to appreciate him." Her voice trembled. "He said he'd ruin us if we backed out." Hamish felt a flicker of sympathy. Gavin's arrogance had been clear to anyone who'd crossed his path. "Why did you stop helping him?" Fiona stared into her mug. "Because I saw what he really wanted. Attention, at any cost. He wasn't telling a story. He was building a spectacle. And when I said no, he shouted at me. Hugh nearly threw him out of the yard." Hamish's brows rose slightly. "Your brother was angry." She nodded. "Hugh doesn't like bullies, never has, but he'd never harm anyone," she added quickly, almost too quickly. Hamish filed away the hesitation. "Did Gavin come to the croft again?" "Yes," she whispered. "He kept trying even after Hugh warned him. I told him to leave me alone. He laughed, said I'd regret it. That's when I knew he'd gone too far." Hamish thanked her. She gripped the edge of the table, as though steadying herself. Lugs nudged her knee gently, earning a strained smile. Back outside, mist had rolled thicker, blurring the edges of the moor. The heather swayed in small tremors as the cold breeze threaded through it. Lugs barked once, sharply, turning toward the moor's edge, where the shadows bled into grey. Hamish followed his gaze, but nothing moved except the drifting vapour. Still, the dog seldom reacted to nothing. Hamish walked the path slowly, boots crunching through frost. The crofters were beginning their morning chores, figures moving like muted silhouettes against the pale backdrop. Somewhere far off, a sheepdog barked. The loch, barely visible through thickening mist, reflected just enough light to glimmer faintly. The case had split in several directions. One branch made of hoax props and petty ambitions. Another made of village humiliation and anger. Another of quiet desperation. Hamish felt them intertwine beneath every polite greeting, every wary glance. He stood on a rise overlooking the moor, the wind tugging at his coat, the mist tugging at his thoughts. Lugs pressed against his leg, steadying him. "Folk get into trouble when they feel cornered," Hamish murmured, and Gavin cornered more than one. The mist wrapped around them, soft and chilly, as though urging him onward. He would follow every thread, every whisper, every quiet hurt. Loch was holding something back. He could feel it in the cold, in the silence, in the tremor of the heather. Something was coming, and he was walking straight toward it. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying with it a sharper, more unsettled edge. It swept down from the moors in thin, needling gusts that tugged at Hamish Macbeth's coat as he walked the loch path with lugs at his side. The morning light had a dull metallic cast, the kind that made Loch look older and more worn than usual. Ripples chased each other across the loch's surface, restless and uneven. Even the reeds seemed jittery, trembling at the slightest touch of air. Hamish paused near the bend, the scent of damp stone and cold water drifting around him. Lug sniffed the air and let out a low growl. Not hostile, but wary. I feel it too, Hamish murmured. Folk are on edge. He turned toward Andrew Black's boathouse. The building crouched at the water's edge like a brooding animal, dark against the pale morning. Andrew's temper had been strained even on good days, and these past few had been anything but. Hamish had a nagging sense that whatever small truths Andrew had offered before weren't the full measure of what he knew. Lugs hesitated at the door. Hamish gave a gentle tap before entering. Inside, the boathouse was dim, lit only by the uneven glow through warped window slats. The scent of old rope and engine oil lingered heavily. Andrew stood at his workbench, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the edge of the table as though he feared he might fly apart if he let go. At the sound of Hamish's step, he jerked around. "What now?" Andrew snapped. His voice was hoarse, as if he'd hardly slept. Hamish kept his tone soft. "Just need to clear a few things up," Andrew snorted. "Clear things up? Aye, well, nothing's clear. Not since that fool turned up with his lights and his big ideas." Hamish stepped further into the room, careful not to corner him. "You told me you warned him about the battery pack." "I did, and he didn't listen." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Thought he knew better than everyone here." Hamish nodded slowly, studying Andrew's hands, white-knuckled, tense. "Did you touch his equipment again after that first time?" Andrew's eyes flickered. "What's that to you?" "It could help," Hamish said simply. The silence that followed was thick and brittle. Andrew's breath grew shallow. Lugs shifted beside Hamish, tail stiff. Outside, the wind scraped along the roof, making the old boards creak. Finally, Andrew exploded. "Fine. I showed him just a bit. Put a fright in him, that's all. I never meant him harm." Hamish felt a small, steadying calm settle over him. "Tell me how." Andrew turned away, shoulders shaking with frustrated anger. "I loosened one of the wires, just enough so his daft rig would spark and scare him. He owed me, Hamish, for the lights he broke, for the time he wasted. I thought if I rattled him, he'd pay up and leave." "Did you know the battery pack was faulty?" "Of course not. I'm not a murderer." Andrew swung round, eyes blazing. "You think I wanted him dead?" Hamish met the man's fury with quiet understanding. "No, I don't." But Andrew was too wound to hear him. With a sudden jerky movement, he pushed past Hamish, stumbling toward the open doorway. "I can't breathe in here," he muttered. "I can't—" "Andrew," Hamish said gently, following him. "Don't go rushing off." But Andrew was already outside, striding toward the rocks by the loch. The wind had picked up, carrying the whispers of an impending shower. Lugs stayed close to Hamish's leg as they followed. "Andrew," Hamish called over the wind. "Take a moment." Andrew spun round near the wet stones, his face twisted with a mix of regret and terror. "You don't understand. If Blair hears I touched that thing, he'll make me the killer before I can spit." "Aye, that's Blair's way," Hamish admitted, stepping closer. "But I'm not Blair. Tell me the truth and I'll see it right." Andrew's breath came fast. The loch churned behind him, growing darker as clouds thickened above. "I only meant to frighten him," Andrew repeated. His voice cracked. "He laughed at me, Hamish. Said him and his creature were going to make Loch famous. Said folk like me should keep quiet and let the clever men work." "And that made you angry," Hamish said softly. Andrew barked a bitter laugh. "Wouldn't it make anyone?" A sudden gust whipped across the rocks, and Andrew slipped slightly at the edge. Hamish reached out instinctively, but Andrew reacted like a trapped animal, shoving him back in panic. Hamish stumbled on the slick stones, catching himself with one hand. Lugs snarled sharply, bounding forward with protective fury. The dog didn't lunge, but his stance made it clear that another shove would be met with teeth. Andrew froze, horror washing over him. I didn't mean—" Hamish, I'm sorry. Hamish straightened, brushing mud from his sleeve. It's all right. Just the rocks making fools of us. Andrew stared at him helplessly. His shoulders sagged. His anger collapsed inward, leaving a hollowed-out sorrow in its place. I swear to you, he whispered, voice breaking. I didn't kill him. After the spark, he shouted at me, said he didn't need me anymore, that his footage would be better without the villagers mucking it up. I walked away. That's all. Hamish believed him. Remorse clung to Andrew like a second skin, but belief wasn't enough. Not yet. The first drops of rain pattered against the rocks. Lugs pressed against Hamish's leg, ears twitching. Go home, Andrew, Hamish said gently. Get yourself warm. I'll come by later. Andrew nodded numbly and trudged back toward the village, shoulders slumped. Left alone with the rising rain, Hamish walked the shoreline slowly. The wind carried the scent of the coming downpour, cold, raw, impatient. The reeds rustled like whispering voices. Lugs trotted beside him, glancing now and then toward the moor. Hamish's thoughts drifted to the croft, the footprints, the shredded props, the second silhouette. Andrew wasn't lying, but he wasn't the only one Gavin had provoked. He stopped near the reeds, staring out at the grey water. The loch was unsettled, shifting in uneasy curls, as if hiding something beneath its surface. The shadow of the real killer felt close, too close, hovering behind every half-truth and every frightened glance. Hamish drew in a slow breath, the cold settling into his chest. Folk don't kill for grand reasons, he murmured. Not here. They kill when something small festers too long. Lugs nudged his hand in quiet agreement. Rain began to fall in earnest, soft at first, then steady, thin lines slanting across the water's surface. The moor blurred at the edges. Loch seemed to hold its breath again, waiting. Hamish turned toward the village, boots squelching in the wet ground. He had a second visitor to seek, and with every passing moment, the circle around the truth tightened. The rain returned in the early afternoon, not with the fierce rage of the previous storm, but with a steady, determined persistence that softened every edge of the village. Hamish Macbeth walked slowly along the Loch road, with Lugs padding beside him, the dog's ears flicking at each patter of drizzle. Mist drifted low over the water, winding between the reeds like pale smoke. The air smelled of wet earth, peat smoke, and damp heather. It was the kind of day that made Loch feel smaller, quieter, as though the landscape itself were holding its breath. Hamish paused near the jetty, watching rain dimpling the loch's surface. The weight of the case pressed gently, but insistently, against his thoughts. Never loud, never dramatic, simply present. Gavin Corcoran had stirred something ugly in Loch, and now that he was dead, those small resentments and embarrassments were shifting beneath the village like unseen tides. Lugs tugged lightly at the lead, urging Hamish toward the hotel. Mrs. Wellington would know something. She always did. And today, Hamish needed the sort of truth that came from irritation rather than fear. Inside the hotel foyer, Mrs. Wellington was arranging a vase of drooping flowers with a kind of fierce precision. She straightened as Hamish entered, her expression already pinched with readiness. "Constable Maher," she said, the word clipped. "Mrs. Wellington." He removed his cap, rainwater dripping from its brim. "I was wondering if I could trouble you for a word." "You may." She glanced around to ensure no guests were within earshot. Then, "I suppose this is about that dreadful man again." Hamish nodded mildly. "Anything more come to mind about him?" Mrs. Wellington's lips tightened. "Only that I should have banned him sooner. He argued with half the village, and then, oh yes, a dreadful row here 2 days ago, with Reverend McPhee of all people." Hamish lifted an eyebrow. "The Reverend?" "He came to tell Gavin to stop filming outside the kirk. Said it disturbed the sanctity," she sniffed. Gavin shouted back, accused him of suppressing folklore for the sake of piety. They were both red in the face. Guests heard them all the way to their rooms. Hamish imagined the Reverend, stiff-backed and scandalised, facing down Gavin's theatrical bluster. Did it end peacefully? "As peacefully as anything involving loud men and fragile egos," she replied. But the Reverend left first. Gavin went storming off toward the loch. Hamish thanked her, and as he turned to leave, Mrs. Wellington added, You'll find something, Hamish. You always do. Village would fall apart without you. He gave a faint, shy smile. Praise always sat awkwardly on him. Just doing my best. Outside, Lugs shook himself vigorously, sending droplets flying. Hamish bent to rub the dog's head. Come on, lad. Reverend next. The kirkyard felt particularly solemn beneath the rain's quiet rhythm. Reverend McPhee stood under the portico, wiping moisture from the stone arch with a handkerchief, as though the weather had personally offended him. Reverend, Hamish said softly. Constable. The Reverend folded the handkerchief crisply. I suppose this is about that wretched fellow again. Aye, Hamish replied. Mrs. Wellington mentioned a quarrel. The Reverend sighed, shoulders sagging. I lost my temper. He insisted on filming silhouettes against the kirk windows, claimed the Gothic atmosphere added mystique to his so-called documentary. He shook his head. I told him he was exploiting local heritage. He accused me of clinging to the past. That's not unusual for newcomers, Hamish said gently. The Reverend bristled. He said the only monster in Loch was the fear of change. He paused, eyes narrowing. But I did not harm him. My words may have been sharp, but that is all. Hamish believed him. Under the Reverend's stiff exterior lay a man who preferred indignation to violence. Still, tempers were telling. Everyone Gavin touched seemed to flare, as though he'd known exactly where to prod. As they left the kirk, Lugs tugged toward the lochside path, nose low to the ground. Hamish let him lead. The dog paused near the base of a gnarled alder tree and barked once. Something lay tangled in the wet grass, a torn strap of leather, frayed at the edges. Hamish crouched, picking it up. The leather was stiff and cracked, with a streak of oily residue smeared across one side. Not the soot from Andrew's battery pack. This was darker, greasier, the kind that clung to hands used to engine oil, tools and machinery. Someone else handled Gavin's rig, Hamish murmured. Lugs pressed close, tail flicking. Hamish slipped the strap into his coat, his mind clicking through quiet possibilities. Someone who knew how to break things subtly. Someone who fixed machinery for half the village. Someone strong enough to leave deep footprints in the croft. Someone like Hugh McLeish. The thought settled in Hamish's chest like a cold pebble. Hugh was not cruel, but he was proud. And pride, in Loch was a dangerous force. Hamish and Lugs made their way toward Patel's shop next. The bell chimed thinly above the door. Patel stood behind the counter, frowning at a stack of invoices. Hamish, he said, looking relieved. Folk are uneasy. Say the Loch's cursed again. When are they not uneasy? Hamish replied with a faint smile. Patel sighed. True enough. He lowered his voice. Gavin came in last week, asking for old parish records. Wanted anything about drownings and sightings. Said he needed it for an expose on the region's dark history. Expose? Hamish repeated quietly. He used the word 3 times. Patel rolled his eyes. I told him such documents belonged to the Kirk Hall, not my shop. Still, he was determined. Wanted to dig up anything scandalous. Hamish's mind moved quietly, from detail to detail. Gavin hadn't been building a simple hoax. He'd been preparing a story, a grand one, meant to make Loch look foolish, superstitious, small. He'd been prodding villagers deliberately, goading reactions, mocking their traditions. And someone with enough bruise to their pride, had snapped. As Hamish left the shop, the rain thickened, falling in soft sheets that blurred the cottages. Lugs trotted close, paws splashing through shallow puddles. Hamish followed the path toward the McLeish croft once more, though every instinct told him to tread carefully. The croft sat lonely on the moor, its roof glistening with rain. Fiona's voice drifted from inside, light, tired, humming without conviction. But Hamish wasn't here for her. He found Hugh around the side, repairing a sagging bit of fencing. The man straightened as Hamish approached, wiping his hands on his trousers. His tall frame was imposing, even in the quiet drizzle. Constable, Hugh said shortly. Hugh. Silence stretched, broken only by the soft patter of rain. Mind if I ask where you were the evening Gavin died? Hamish asked, calmly. Hugh's jaw tightened. Told you before. Inside with my mother. Neither of you saw Gavin? No. The word came too quickly, too flat. Lugs let out a low growl, not loud, not aggressive, but questioning. Hugh took an uneasy half-step back. Hamish studied him. The man's hands were rough, stained with engine oil, the kind that matched the residue on the torn strap. "Funny thing," Hamish said softly. "I found a leather strap near the loch. Torn, oily. Looked like it belonged to Gavin's rig." Hugh's eyes flickered. "He came here often, didn't he?" Hamish continued gently. "Looking for Fiona's help." Hugh's throat bobbed in a swallow. "Aye. He bothered her. Wouldn't leave her be. And when you told him to stay away..." Hugh's gaze dropped to the ground. Rain beaded in his hair. Men like him, they think they can push folk around, think their cameras and fancy words make them better. "Aye," Hamish murmured. "He mocked you." "He mocked Loch, Hugh snapped, then froze, realising his own admission. Hamish stepped closer, voice soft as the rain. "Did you go to the old croft with him?" "No," Hugh said, too quickly again. "You helped mend tools there," Hamish said mildly. "I saw the prints." For a moment Hugh's shoulders sagged, not in guilt, but in weariness, like a man carrying a weight too heavy for too long. "I didn't kill him," Hugh said finally, the words trembling at their edges. "But I told him, if he hurt Fiona again, he'd regret it." Hamish held his gaze, calm, steady. "Did you sabotage his equipment?" Hugh hesitated, a breath, a heartbeat. Then, "I only meant to stop him, didn't think. He broke off, jaw clenching tight. The truth hovered just beyond reach, not fully confessed, not fully denied, but enough for Hamish to feel its shape. Rain drifted heavier, softening the world into greys. Hamish stepped back. "Thank you, Hugh. Get inside, you're soaked." Hugh blinked, surprised by the gentleness, then nodded and disappeared into the croft. Hamish turned toward the moor path again. Lugs pressed close, sensing his quiet tension. "Aye, lad," Hamish whispered. "We're almost there." The rain drew a soft veil over the village, obscuring edges, disguising distances, but not truth, never truth. Something was close now, very close, and Hamish could feel it breathing just beyond the mist, waiting to be found. The morning settled over Loch with a cold stillness that clung to every fence post and wet stone. Mist drifted low along the moor, as if reluctant to rise, curling lazily across dips in the ground. Hamish Macbeth walked the path toward the McLeish croft, with Lugs padding quietly beside him. The dog's ears flicked at each distant sound, a lone sheep bleating, a loose gate tapping in the wind. There was tension in the air, thin as fishing line, but unmistakable. Hamish felt it tugging at him. Hugh McLeish had said too much and too little. The truth lay in the gap between the two. The croft stood ahead, its stone walls darkened by the morning damp. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin thread, dissolving before it reached the low clouds. Hugh was outside, hammering a plank against a leaning fence post. He struck it with unnecessary force, each blow a blunt punctuation of frustration. He didn't look up as Hamish approached. Lugs paused a few steps behind Hamish, hackles slightly raised. The dog sensed tension before Hamish ever needed to. "Morning, Hugh," Hamish said softly. Another hard strike of the hammer. "Aye. Fence giving you trouble?" Hugh lowered the hammer, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Wood's warped from the rain. Needs fixing." Hamish nodded, studying the man's posture, rigid, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the ground, as though it might accuse him. "Mind if we talk a moment?" Hugh wiped his hands on his trousers. "About what?" Hamish reached into his coat and withdrew the torn strap of leather. Moisture had stiffened it overnight, but the black oily residue was clearer now. "This was found near the loch," Hamish said gently. "Matches the straps on Gavin's rig. The residue, well, it's not from Andrew's battery pack." Hugh's hand froze mid-movement. His breath caught. Lugs let out a low, steady growl, not loud, not threatening, just a warning note of unease. Hugh swallowed. "A lot of folk use leather straps." "Aye," Hamish said quietly, "but only a few use this sort of oil. Tractor engines, generator belts, repairs done late at night with old tools." Hugh said nothing, his jaw clenched, working against itself. Hamish didn't move closer. He simply lowered his voice. "You told me yesterday Gavin mocked Fiona, mocked you too, that he came here asking for help, that you warned him off." "Aye," Hugh muttered. And you told me you left him alive. Hugh's eyes flickered again. Too quick, too defensive. Hamish waited. Patience often coaxed more truth than pressure. Finally, Hugh exhaled. He pushed her too far, Hamish. You didn't hear the things he said. Called her simple, called us all simple, said his film would show the world what a backward hole this place is. Lugs shifted closer to Hamish's leg. Hugh continued, voice cracking at the edges. I found him by the loch, told him to stay away from Fiona. He laughed in my face. And then? Hamish asked quietly. Hugh gripped the hammer handle so tightly his knuckles whitened. I shoved him, a small shove, enough to wipe the smile off. He stumbled in the mud, cursed me, said he'd show us all when his monster went worldwide. Hamish's expression remained mild, almost sympathetic. And that's when you followed him to the croft? Hugh stiffened. I never said I went there. No, Hamish agreed. But your eyes did. Hugh turned away, shoulders rising in a shudder. The wind picked up, rattling the fence behind them. A pair of crows lifted off a nearby post, their wings cutting through the mist. I went after him, Hugh said at last, voice low. He was dragging his equipment toward the croft. Said it was his workshop where he'd build the next stage of the monster. I told him it was dangerous. Told him the battery pack was sparking. He didn't care. Did you warn him about it? Hamish asked. I did, Hugh said fiercely. But he said if something happened, it'd make his documentary more authentic. Hugh spat the word. Hamish nodded slowly. And the leather strap? Hugh hesitated, just long enough to answer the question fully. I pulled at it, he admitted, just to stop him setting the stupid thing up. The strap snapped. He shouted again, and Hugh broke off, shoulders trembling. I grabbed the rig, yanked it, maybe too hard. Something sparked. He jumped back, swearing. But he was alive when I left him. On my mother's grave, Hamish, alive. Hamish studied him carefully. Hugh's distress was genuine. His hands shook. His eyes glistened, not with guilt, but with the shame of losing his temper. But there was something wrong, something that didn't fit. Why did you lie about going to the croft yesterday? Hamish asked softly. Hugh flinched. Didn't want folk thinking I was involved. Andrew had already been dragged about by Blair. Last thing I needed was gossip tearing Fiona apart. Gossip doesn't tear folk apart, Hamish said gently. Secrets do. Hugh looked at him then, really looked. Eyes raw with fear and pride in equal measure. I didn't mean for any of this. Gavin was a bully, a big voice in a small place, but I didn't kill him. Hamish believed that. Not fully, but enough to see the shape of Hugh's truth. A truth patched together with omissions and false starts. But Hugh's gaze kept drifting, twice, then a third time, toward the moor path leading to the abandoned croft. Hamish followed the glance each time. Hugh wasn't pointing with his eyes in fear. He was pointing in reluctance. Something remained there, something he hadn't shared, something he couldn't bear to say aloud. Hamish let the silence stretch. You're a good man, Hugh, he said at last. A temper's no crime. Wanting to protect Fiona isn't either. But you're holding something back. Hugh shook his head quickly. I told you all of it. Hamish's tone stayed level. Folk don't look at the same place 3 times unless something's on their mind. Hugh's breath hitched. It's nothing. You sure? Hugh swung the hammer again, hitting the post with a jarring thud. I'm sure. But Lugs growled softly, stepping half a pace forward. The dog's instincts rarely failed him. Hamish rested a hand on Lugs's head, steadying him. All right, Hugh. I won't push you today. You shouldn't push at all, Hugh muttered, not looking up. Hamish ignored the jab. Take care of yourself, and Fiona. Hugh nodded stiffly. Hamish turned away, rain beginning to fall again, thin and cold, threading down the back of his neck. Lugs stayed close, ears back, watching Hugh with wary concern. As Hamish reached the edge of the croft, he paused. Hugh's hammering had stopped. The silence behind him was tight, suffocating, as if someone had pulled a rope around the breath of the land itself. He's lying, Hamish murmured to Lugs, but not about what matters most, something else, something he's afraid to say. Lugs gave a small whine, nudging Hamish's knee. Hamish looked out toward the moor. Mist wrapped the abandoned croft in its pale shroud. Footprints would be blurred now, washed by the rain, but the truth lingered like peat smoke, slow, clinging, impossible to banish. Whatever happened, Hamish whispered, it didn't end with Hugh. He and Lugs walked on, the rain deepening, the world shrinking into greys. Somewhere in that shrinking world lay the missing piece, small, ordinary, sharp enough to cut, and Hamish felt its edge drawing closer. The fog had settled early that evening, rolling down from the moors, in slow deliberate folds, as though the land wished to hide itself from what Hamish Macbeth was about to learn. The path to the abandoned croft glistened with moisture, each stone slick underfoot. Lugs walked close at his side, silent except for the soft pad of paws on damp earth. The air smelled of wet peat and cold loch water, the kind of smell that seeped into wool and lingered for days. Hamish pulled his collar up as the mist curled around them, blurring the edges of the landscape until the croft appeared like a ghost rising out of the haze. The broken roof slouched under its own weight, and the door hung crooked, creaking faintly whenever the breeze nudged it. A weak moon glimmered behind the clouds, offering only a pale suggestion of light. Hamish paused at the threshold, Lugs leaning into his leg with a low whine. "Aye, lad," Hamish whispered. "Feels wrong to me as well." He pushed the door open. Inside, the croft smelled of damp stone and the lingering bitterness of old machinery. The beam from Hamish's torch slid across the uneven floorboards, catching glints of metal, discarded wires, clamps, the remnants of Gavin's foolish project. Farther inside, among a jumble of broken props, something caught the light differently. A second battery pack, partly hidden under a pile of damp fabric. Hamish knelt, careful not to disturb anything more than necessary. This battery was intact but purposely altered. 2 wires twisted together in a way that suggested deliberation rather than accident. Whoever did this knew how to make it spark on command. Not anger, not improvisation, planning. "Someone meant it to frighten him," Hamish murmured. "Not kill him, but frighten him properly." Lugs shifted uneasily. The fog pressed against the windows, like a living thing. For a moment the croft felt smaller, tighter, as if it were holding its breath. "That's enough of that." The voice behind him was low, roughened by emotion rather than threat. Hamish didn't turn immediately. He didn't need to. He recognised it. Hugh McLeish stood in the doorway, broad shoulders filling the frame, his figure blurred at the edges by the fog drifting in behind him. His hair was damp, his face pale, jaw clenched hard enough to tremble. Hamish rose slowly, brushing dust from his knees. "Evening, Hugh." Hugh swallowed, eyes fixed on the battery pack. "You weren't meant to find that. I figured as much." A taut silence hung between them. Somewhere outside, a sheep bleated faintly, the sound muffled by mist. "You came back," Hugh said, voice a low rasp. "Couldn't let it rest." Hamish kept his tone mild. "Folk rarely tell the whole truth when they're afraid." "And you'd know about fear, would you?" Hugh snapped, then immediately deflated. "Sorry, shouldn't take it out on you." "It's all right." Hamish nodded toward the battery. "Want to tell me what really happened?" Hugh stepped inside, closing the door halfway. It wasn't a threat, it was a resignation. He rubbed both hands over his face, smearing dampness across his cheeks. "He wanted to use Fiona," Hugh said at last. "That's what he wanted all along. Not just her help, her humiliation. He said he'd fake footage, make her look like some village fool who believed in monsters. Said he'd broadcast it, that it'd put Loch on the map." Hamish's chest tightened, though his expression stayed gently neutral. "Fiona's a good lass. Didn't deserve that." "No one does," Hugh muttered. Hamish waited. He always waited. Silence often told a man it was safe to speak. Hugh rubbed his neck, eyes fixed on the floor. "I sabotaged the first battery. A small spark, nothing more. Just to give him a fright. I didn't think it'd do any harm, only enough to make him leave Fiona alone. And Gavin didn't take it well," Hamish said softly. "He came back furious," Hugh whispered. "Stormed up to me by the loch. Said he'd ruin our family. Said Fiona would be a laughingstock. And you followed him here?" Hugh nodded, his breath shuddering out. "I told him he'd gone too far. He laughed in my face, called me a dumb brute, said he'd film me next." Hamish pictured Gavin, loud, theatrical, careless with the dignity of others. And Hugh, already raw with protectiveness and shame. A volatile mix on any calm day, let alone one drowned in fog and pride. What happened next? Hamish asked gently. Hugh braced both hands on the croft wall, head bowed. He pushed me first, not hard, just enough to make his point. But I lost it for a moment. I shoved him harder. He fell backward into the reeds near his rig. Hamish felt a quiet ache settle behind his ribs, and the battery sparked. Aye, Hugh's voice trembled. Just a small flash, enough to daze him. He wasn't burned badly, not the way a faulty battery could have done, but he looked stunned, like he didn't know which way was up. And you left him, Hamish said quietly. Hugh's answer was a broken whisper. I didn't think he'd drown. Lugs edged closer to Hamish, sensing the weight of the confession. Hugh leaned heavily against the wall, shoulders shaking, breath catching in ragged bursts. He wasn't a violent man, only a proud one pushed one step too far. Hamish let the silence sit. Then, why didn't you say this before? Because it sounds like murder. Hugh wiped a sleeve across his eyes. And Blair would love to toss me into a cell and crow to Strathbane that he solved a killing. He'd never hear the truth of it. Hamish couldn't argue. Blair would twist Hugh's panic into intent and his regret into guilt. Strathbane didn't do nuance, or accidents, or human frailty. Hugh, Hamish said softly, you meant to frighten him, and you panicked. You should have called for help. I know, Hugh whispered. God help me, I know. Hamish stepped closer, but not too close. Listen to me. Gavin's death was a tangle of small mistakes. Yours. His. A bit of temper, a bit of pride. None of it makes you evil. None of it makes you a murderer. But it makes me responsible. Hugh's voice cracked fully now. He died because of me. The fog pressed against the walls, thick and cold. Outside, rain began to fall. Soft, steady, as though the sky had grown tired of holding itself together. Hugh sank onto an old crate, burying his face in his hands. The croft felt unbearably quiet. Even Lugg seemed to understand, lying down beside Hamish with a soft sigh. Hamish let the moment breathe before speaking again. I'll do what I can, but you'll still have to face the consequences. Hugh nodded, shoulders slumped in resignation. Hamish exhaled, feeling a deep sadness settle over him. Loch wasn't a place of grand crimes, only small human failings that spiraled into darkness before anyone noticed. As he stepped toward the door, Lugs pressed close, steady as stone. Hugh looked up, eyes full of defeat. What now? Hamish paused in the doorway. Now, he said quietly, I have to tell the truth, all of it. Rain pattered softly against the croft stones, a thin curtain falling between Hamish and the long road back to the village. The night felt heavy, mournful, holding its breath once more. Hamish touched Lugs's head. Come on, lad. They stepped into the mist, leaving Hugh alone in the dim croft, his confession echoing quietly in the cold, wet air. The next morning arrived with a thin, washed-out light that barely touched the loch. A pale mist drifted low over the water, settling thick along the village roofs, as though Loch itself wished to muffle whatever unpleasantness was left to come. Hamish Macbeth walked the narrow road toward the station, with Hugh MacLeish beside him. Hugh's shoulders were stiff, his head bowed, his boots dragging, as if the very ground resisted carrying him forward. Lugs padded a step ahead, glancing back now and then with an anxious whine. Hamish kept his pace gentle, not quite slow, but steady, something Hugh could keep up with without feeling herded. Shame clung to Hugh like a damp coat, heavy and immovable. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke, drifting from croft chimneys, and the sharper scent of wet grass. The morning chill seemed to press into the bones. You're doing right by Fiona, Hamish said quietly, and by yourself. Hugh didn't look up. Feels more like I'm walking into a noose. No nooses in Loch, Hamish murmured, though he knew Strathbane's presence would feel like one. Lugs gave a low rumble of agreement, or protest, hard to tell. As they rounded the bend near Patel's shop, the unmistakable shout of Chief Inspector Blair cracked through the morning air, like a crow scolding the sun. There he is, Macbeth, you useless lump. Where have you been hiding? The whole case solved without your interference. Hamish sighed inwardly. He should have expected this. Blair stood in the station doorway, chest puffed out so far his buttons seemed at risk. Anderson flapped behind him like an anxious hen, carrying a stack of files he very clearly wished he weren't responsible for. Daviet had already arrived, a rarity, standing stiffly in his long coat, trying to project authority despite looking slightly lost in the damp Highland air. "Macbeth," Daviet said briskly. "Blair has informed me he's identified the perpetrator. Excellent work, Blair." Blair smirked. "Aye, sir. It was obvious to a trained investigator. Young MacLeish here, skulking about, temper like a bairn, and a clear motive. Simple." Hamish kept his face neutral. Hugh's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I'm filing a full report," Blair continued, swaggering. "Macbeth can add his wee footnotes if he likes, but I've wrapped this one up." Hamish nodded politely. "Aye, sir." Blair blinked, thrown off by the lack of argument. Good. Thought as much." Inside, the station was warm with stale heat, the kind that made the air feel overly thick. Hamish guided Hugh to a chair before stepping to his desk. Blair hovered nearby, expecting praise, or perhaps expecting Hamish to trip over his own paperwork as usual. Instead, Hamish quietly filled out the incident forms with neat, concise statements. He didn't embellish, didn't point fingers. He simply wrote what had happened: Hugh's admission of tampering, the confrontation by the Loch, the spark, the panic. Everything true, everything simple. And woven throughout, without accusation or commentary, were Blair's many hasty assumptions, premature conclusions, and a few minor contradictions in his own report. Not lies, just facts. Blair's own behaviour presented plainly. Daviet glanced over Hamish's shoulder once, frowning. Blair shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. "Well," Daviet said after a long silence, "it seems we have closure. Tragic business, but tidy enough." "Tidy's not the word I'd use," Hamish murmured. Blair snapped sharply. "Macbeth!" But Daviet raised a hand. "Let's not make more of it. A terrible accident brought on by hot tempers. It won't look too bad for the region's tourism budget." He cleared his throat, all political angles and polished indifference. "Blair, well done. Anderson, file the necessary statements. Macbeth, carry on." And they were gone. Blair swaggering, Anderson scurrying, Daviet already imagining himself giving careful, sanitised remarks to some committee in Strathbane. Hugh sat motionless, staring at his hands. The weight of responsibility had settled fully now, not the dramatic weight of guilt, but the quieter, heavier burden of knowing how one moment can change everything. "You'll not be dragged through the mud," Hamish said softly, sitting beside him. "I'll see to that. Folk know your heart." Hugh swallowed hard. "Thank you." The words were soft, raw. Hamish escorted him out. The villagers had begun gathering outside, drawn not by curiosity, but by something closer to solemnity. Crofters with tired eyes, fishermen shifting awkwardly, Mrs. Patel standing in her doorway, hands clasped tight. Even the Curry sisters, who normally relished any whiff of scandal, kept their voices lowered. No one jeered, no one whispered accusations. A quiet understanding passed through the crowd. Loch protected its own, even when mistakes were made. Fiona emerged last, her hair damp from mist, her face pale. She went to Hugh without hesitation, taking his arm, steadying him. Then she turned to Hamish, eyes glassy. "Constable," she whispered. "Thank you." Her voice broke. Hamish only nodded, awkward with emotion, uncertain what to do with his hands. Lugs nudged his knee gently, grounding him. The villagers slowly dispersed, leaving behind a hush heavier than any storm. Hamish stood for a moment, letting the damp air settle over him. Then he turned toward the Loch path, needing space, needing quiet. Lugs followed, paws padding softly on the wet earth. The Loch was still, its surface a dull grey glass. Mist drifted lazily, carrying with it the muted calls of distant birds. The world felt suspended, caught between sorrow and acceptance. Hamish walked slowly, hands in his pockets, breath misting faintly in the chill. "Folk don't realise," he murmured to Lugs, "how small things grow. A word, a laugh, a bit of shame. Before you know it, it's too late." Lugs pressed close, tail brushing Hamish's leg. Sensing the melancholy, that clung to him. Hamish stopped at the water's edge, staring out over the loch where reeds bent gently under the weight of lingering fog. "No monsters in the loch," Hamish said quietly. "Only in ourselves." The breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain from the hills. Hamish exhaled deeply. The sound soft in the morning stillness. There would be more paperwork, more questions, more gossip. But for now, there was only the loch, the mist, and the quiet companionship of a loyal dog. Lugs gave a small huff as if agreeing. Hamish rested a hand on the dog's head. "Come on, boy, let's go home." They walked on together, the loch fading behind them, the path ahead disappearing gently into the morning fog. Dusk settled over Loch Dhu with a softness that felt almost careful, as though the village had endured enough sharp edges for 1 week. A faint wash of lavender light stretched across the moors, fading by the minute as mist drifted in slow, curling ribbons down toward the loch. Hamish Macbeth stood outside his cottage for a moment, hands shoved deep into his pockets, breathing in the cool, damp air. Lugs pressed against his leg, tail giving a faint, steady thump. The day had left its weight on both of them. Hamish pushed open the cottage door. The familiar scent of peat smoke greeted him, earthy and comforting. Inside, the fire in the hearth burned low but steady, its warmth stretching outward in gentle pulses. Hamish hung his wet jacket by the door and set about coaxing the fire higher. The flames brightened reluctantly, licking at the fresh peat with orange-tipped determination. "Lazy things," Hamish muttered under his breath. Lugs settled onto the tartan rug with a small grunt, curling into a warm loaf of dog. Hamish filled the kettle and set it on the stove. Tea would do little to fix the heaviness in his chest, but it would take the edge off the quiet. The case, if one could call it that, was finished. Papers signed, statements filed, Blair loudly declaring victory while understanding nothing. Daviot whisking everything away to Strathbane to polish the unpleasant bits until they gleamed faintly with acceptable bureaucracy. And Hamish, as always, stood to the side. He poured himself a weak cup of tea and sat near the hearth. The warmth seeped into his knees. Lugs shifted, resting his chin on Hamish's boot. Outside, the wind tugged at the eaves with a soft, lonely whistle. "It wasn't murder," Hamish said quietly, more to himself than the dog. "Just a stupid, sad mess of tempers." Lugs blinked slow agreement. Hamish sipped his tea. The warmth did little, but it steadied his breathing. He had saved the village again, quietly, gently, in the way no one ever noticed unless he failed. No fame, no grand speeches, just a nudge here, a question there, a truth woven carefully through a tangle of human frailty. That was his place. The quiet guardian of Loch Dhu, stepping between villagers and disaster with nothing more than empathy and a knack for seeing what others missed. He drained the cup, stood, and pulled on his coat once more. "Come on, Lugs," he said. "One last walk." The dog rose instantly, ears perked, tail high. They stepped outside into the cool dusk. The sky above the loch had darkened to deep blue, streaked with the last faint threads of dying daylight. Mist drifted across the shoreline in pale sheets, each wave rolling in with a hush. The reeds whispered softly as the breeze threaded through them. Somewhere far off, a single sheep called out, a lonely bleat that echoed across the moor. Hamish and Lugs walked the narrow footpath beside the water. The loch itself was still, almost glass-like, reflecting nothing but its own quiet depths. No monster shadows, no proof for Gavin's absurd documentary, only the simple, ancient calm of a highland loch settling into night. Hamish paused near the rocks where the reeds grew thickest, the place where Gavin had fallen, where pride and temper had collided with cold water and bad luck. He exhaled slowly. His breath fogged, then disappeared. "So much fuss," he murmured, "all for something that never existed." Lugs nudged his hand gently, breaking the heaviness. Hamish rubbed the dog's ears, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Aye, you're right. Best not to brood." They continued along the path. Lights flickered in cottage windows across the village, warm yellow squares glowing through the mist. The faint scent of someone's supper drifted across the air. Fish, butter, a hint of onion. Normal life creeping back already. Tomorrow would bring gossip, of course, careful, hushed gossip. But soon enough, Loch would return to its usual rhythm of petty squabbles, weather complaints, and the small comforts of village life. And Hamish would drift through it all, half part of it, half apart from it. He paused again at the far curve of the loch, where the water turned dark as ink. The mist wrapped around him, gentle and cool. Luggs sat at his feet, patient and attentive. Hamish gazed out at the stillness. "Folk talk about monsters in the loch," he said, quietly, "but the only monsters are the ones we make ourselves." Luggs leaned softly against him. Hamish gave a soft hum of agreement. "Aye, lad, better to keep watch." A faint breeze stirred, carrying the clean, earthy scent of approaching rain. The sky overhead thickened with darkening cloud. He took one last look at the loch, peaceful, quiet, unchanged by the tragedy that had played out along its edges. Life, Hamish mused, rarely changed in grand strokes. It shifted in small breaths, small choices, small mistakes, and tomorrow would come all the same. "Let's go home," he said. Luggs trotted beside him as they made their way back toward the faint lights of the village. Their silhouettes blended slowly into the mist, two quiet figures returning to their quiet life. Hamish's steps were steady, his heart both heavy and strangely at ease. The loch lay behind them, still and dark, holding its secrets in the cool dusk air, and Hamish walked forward, guardian of a village that would never quite know how much it owed him.